Hi guys, I'm John Edward Willie, and if you look, you'll see that the subtitle of my channel, John Edward Willie, is Philosophy, Poetry, and Life. Those are the three things that are sort of the underlying pillars of my thinking and my existence in this world. And by being three, it's sort of uneven. In other words, it's the kind of table that is wobbly. You know, if I had four pillars, perhaps that would be more sturdy. What I mean to say is that philosophy, poetry, and life are crucial. And not only that, but the exploration of the relationship between philosophy and poetry and life is what I do primarily. It's sort of the underlying architecture of my mind, in that I'm never living totally in one of those territories. I'm always, in a way, circulating between these themes. Philosophy, that is thinking, that is trying to get clarity, trying to get rationality and understanding, perhaps a bit of control over ourselves. Poetry, that is not relegating it to mere entertainment, but being the very way in which the universe speaks to us. That is through poetic language, which isn't chained to the necessity of continually making clear propositions, but can make a proposition in itself. That is, begin to speak figuratively, begin to speak in a way that is analogical as opposed to analytical. And what I'm suggesting is that poetry and philosophy are different ways of thinking, but the relationship between the two is quite juicy, if you don't mind me saying so. It's intellectually juicy, you know, and philosophy's beginnings are in a tension or relationship with poetry. It's no coincidence that Plato had banned the poets from the Republic. And it happens that Socrates, in one of the dialogues, asked his interlocutor whether or not he should have been singing all along. That is, he should have been making Homeric epics as opposed to Socratic philosophizing. And that's because even in opposing what he thought of as poetry, what he thought of as the superficial, Plato was sort of man enough to allow himself to sustain the possibility that he was wrong. And in fact, he may have never even believed his own thinking, because in many ways he pays tribute to the significant other in his thinking, meaning that philosophy in its very origins in Plato is already beginning to feel nostalgic for the metaphors, for the analogies that it has broken away from. And so I think a part of what I do in philosophizing isn't in reducing one to the other. That's crucial, because philosophy is not poetry and poetry is not philosophy, but there is an inherent dialectic. There's sort of a dialogue between the two. And what that means is that a particular kind of poetic philosophical thinking can really animate like one's very sense of like how life and philosophy and poetry come together. And yet that in itself is an open-ended experimental project. And that's precisely like what I am in doing this, an experimental project. And what I mean to emphasize is that it's a mistake to reduce philosophy to poetry. And so what we're not doing is creating a unified theory or a unified idea. What we're doing is perhaps teasing out the possibility that it's not that logic isn't universal, but that the way that logic operates within the modality of art, poetry, movies is a different kind of logic, which isn't reducible to traditional logic or even semiotics, which is a kind of linguistic logic. And so there's a kind of openness that's discovered in living through this possibility. And yet, why would I attach the word life to this? Why isn't it just philosophy and poetry? And not only that, but is philosophy reducible to life or vice versa? I'm not trying to play with words or be cute, but I'm meaning to emphasize something that is vitally important to me. Because although I'm fundamentally fascinated with and living through the philosophical life, all the while being deeply, madly in love with poetry, these things are not primary. Life itself is what's primary, and it's life that I begin with, right? And I think that that ability to be earthbound, that ability to recall and embody the fact that we are brains and that we are rooted in the earth. Even if we have walking feet, we shouldn't be confused into thinking that we're not earth beings. And so when we begin with that thought, we then begin to think, what is philosophy and poetry in relation to that? Well, philosophy is inherently skeptical. So in many ways, the way that philosophy manifests itself, and whenever it replaces life, this becomes deadly, it's dangerous, in fact, it's unhealthy. So that's what I'm trying to stop. One begins to presume that the mind is primary and life is secondary. And it's not just that that's a kind of fool's errand, but that's the basic mistake in most intellectual lives, you know? And what I'm saying is very subtle, and I think that there's a sense that if you can see it, you can see it already. But what we want to do is not begin with doubt, not begin with the idea that we are subjects in an objective world and that what we are doing is doubting the world's existence, like that is being philosophical. And what we're doing instead is beginning with the fact that we are alive already. We are thrown into this world. We are beings in this world who are as much a part of the world as an apple that falls from an apple tree. Not that that's an apple tree, but you know what I'm saying. Meaning that we are expressions of this world, right? We often think of ourselves almost as alien creatures who don't belong here. But that very idea is rooted in the mistake that I'm suggesting. The idea that we can begin with philosophy, we can begin with thinking, that's a mistake, because it leads to the kinds of people that you see often, more often than not, who are alienated or caught up in an exasperating anxiety and depression. Not that those states aren't very real and very singular for each person going through it, but that there's an underlying kind of atmosphere in our lives and in all of our lives that is made up of all kinds of sort of ideas about what it means to be alive and who we are and what the world is. And that's precisely what I'm challenging in suggesting that no, actually you are what you are in the way that you wake up and you discover yourself to have a particular horizon. That is, you have been cast from the past into a present moment that is being torn asunder by the future. And I'm not merely trying to be cute with my language. I have to guard myself against that, because what I'm trying to suggest is that there's a fundamental change that is related to life and thinking. And that change begins when one awakes one fine day to discover how correct Darwin was, that we are animals, we are brains, and we are bodies. And that sets up a certain amount of opportunities and possibilities, as well as difficulties and embodied truths that are resulting from our embeddedness. And so when I affirm life and then think of philosophy and poetry in relation to life, I find that there's one thing that's crucial, and that is you have to have a clear view of where you're at, of who you are, of what your values are, of what your beliefs are. Not the beliefs you want to have, but you have to begin with a particular kind of perceptual change, wherein you begin to see yourself as something that is becoming what it already is. Meaning that you're not trying to change yourself, but you're also not letting go of yourself. What you're doing is practicing the dance that living demands, and not demands like it's a duty, but it's the very source of enrichment and exaltation. And I'm speaking, you know, from the pulpit as one that lives through this on a semi-regular basis. Not that my life is like rosy in any way, but there's a way in which our very attitude and our very sensibility, once it is changed, it's almost as if the world itself begins to change. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because I haven't even begun to talk about what I'm thinking about in regards to life. If there's a logic that makes like art and poetry what it is, that's different, not like it's totally different, but it's different than what philosophical logic is, or what logic is in most of our lives, then what is logic in life, right? Because my suspicion is that it's very fleshy, like real stuff of life is prior to the philosophical conception. And not only do I think this is an idea that I'm having a hell of a time articulating, so please forgive me. I'm trying my best, just desperately, to get these ideas out so in some way. That's what so much of my writing is. But I think that when we are thinking about what our life is, the fundamental principle in that is the principle of autonomy. And so I think of autonomy as being something that is unique in what I'm doing, because it's not reducible to philosophy or poetry, and yet it ironically embodies them in their best form. And autonomy demands, the reason that I'm separating it from poetry and from philosophy is that it demands a kind of affirmation, as I have said, of your existence. And that's abstract, but what I want to do is to tie that into how this can manifest itself in many different forms in a person's life. I mean, God help me if I can do that. But that's what I want to do. I want to make this real. Like, what is autonomy? What is freedom? What is freedom? What is free choice? I say autonomy because it carries with it a particular relationship to other ideas that I do think deserve relation. And those ideas are such as freedom, or being able to creatively make sense of your life, to authorize yourself, to give yourself permission to become whatever you are in your pure singularity. And traditionally, if you listen to any of the videos that are out there on YouTube, they're going to tell you that autonomy as a word, even freedom, you know, if we're stepping back and thinking historically about it, freedom wasn't reserved for individuals until the European Enlightenment. Now, of course, obviously, there's an underlying sense that clearly freedom has existed, even while the state has had domination, or there's been a kind of anarchic state. So that's not what we're saying. But what I'm suggesting is that the concept of autonomy and freedom was relegated to a local area, a tribe, a state, a nation, and they were given the right to choose for a people. And what this means is that historically you've had no freedom really in any society. We have been so overwhelmed and so used to a particular European idea of freedom that we really take it for granted. And so we're really just disconnected from how actually radically new this experiment is. This experiment that we've been practicing for 200, 300, 400 years is an experiment in individual autonomy. And the philosopher that is connected with this is Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant in many ways is seen as the philosopher who affirmed the individual capacity to self-govern, to choose and rule rationally over one's self. And so if we're being simplistic about it, you know, for time's sake, we could say that this was the birth of the individualism that we think of as individualism, although it would come to have many different forms not connected to Kant at all. But he's largely responding to a tradition going back to Thomas Hobbes and Plato, which affirmed the rule of the state, the rule of the tribe, the rule of the bureaucracy to decide your place in life. And so one has to begin with a kind of respect, a kind of honoring of what Kant was doing. And Kant is a part of the Enlightenment. So Enlightenment itself has a relationship to autonomy and freedom. But that's not the end of the story. You know, Kant is at a source of things that would have blown his mind, because it went in very conservative directions, and in the terms of becoming a desire to preserve a very staunch form of individualism that came out of Kant and all of the ways that freedom was then understood in the 19th century and the 20th century. But clearly there's a relation between Kant and the French Revolution and even the American Revolution, although chronologically the times don't add up. But we see that it's easy to take this for granted. And it's not Kant alone. I mean, he's a part of a whole group of people who are developing this idea that people are capable of rationally deciding what they want to do. And not only that, but that there was a moral responsibility for them to do that, even if that meant living against others. And even the anarchist tradition that I come out of was sort of a reconstructed anarchist, largely turns away from the Kantian origin because it's so caught up in Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Marx, and there's an ongoing like sort of behind the scenes conversation, if not full out war, between the anarchist and the Marxist and their variations historically. And Americans are not really aware of that because we've really just blotted out all of that. And so the kind of autonomy that is very superficial that we hold on to, not that, I mean, it's not superficial because there's nothing superficial about what we are and what we're doing, but it's very narrow compared to the wide varieties of what autonomy can mean in a sense of radical pluralism. That is, the American conception of freedom is robust and it's quite wonderful, and I'm clearly sort of a living example of its attempts and its failures, because I mean, you could also be said that the people who are developing these ideas of freedom and autonomy are also ignoring the others. You know, they're sort of presuming that for many of them that this meant white straight men who would have the autonomy and the power, so it meant an aristocracy. So like, that's why I love Walt Whitman, because he's sort of like a beautiful expression of what this positive version of autonomy might mean. But you also have Frederick Douglass, who is a very different kind of radical representation of autonomy. And these are more familiar to us than the wide varieties of what autonomy could mean, for instance, to the anarcho-feminist of the 19th and 20th century, like Voltairine de Cleyre and Louise Michel, if I'm pronouncing her name correctly. They're examples of a particular kind of conception of freedom that largely escapes us. And I think it's precisely these kinds of forms of autonomy that have escaped us that I think I'm wanting to put at the center of my conception of what life is. And so I'm proposing a radical autonomy as a fundamental philosophy of life. And this means it's anti-philosophical and anti-poetry because it's wanting to begin with the conditions of life. And what would that mean? You know, what would it mean to be free within the conditions of life? Not as an abstract conception, but as a reality. Well, what it might mean is this. It could mean that on the one hand, what a person is trying to do is to make enough money or to earn enough material conditions so that they can not be told what to do, so that tyranny is not forcing itself upon them, whether it's a government bureaucracy that's forcing itself upon them or the will of the people that's forcing itself upon them. For a lot of people, this is the fundamental basis of all political movements, and it's almost as if they can't operate without having this conception of freedom as being one that has to remove all barriers to freedom, has to deconstruct every narrative in the name of a continual liberating freedom. That's something that I don't really have much in common with, because what I'm suggesting is something a bit more human. But what this conception of freedom is sometimes called is negative freedom. And negative freedom is the kind of freedom that we have when we are able to be alone, to be left alone, right? And then there's a there's a conception of positive freedom as being not being removed from tyranny or repression, but in many ways being given what you deserve. Positive freedom in a certain level, from an anarchist position, if you're being affirmative about it, it means taking back what's been taken from you. And this is very dangerous politically, but I like to co-opt this idea of taking back what's been taken from us by appropriating it in a way that means taking back our individual lives, taking back our very experience. Like, we have to begin with the affirmation of our experience as being real and valuable and beautiful. And not only that, but being true, as being the basis of something that we can act upon. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because what I'm trying to enunciate is that when one is being simplistic, one is seeing that historically individual freedom was really a novelty, it's really a rarity. It's not until in many ways Europe in the 17th and 18th century freed it, that it became what we think of it as being individual freedom. So I mean, it's our loss that we don't really realize that we are living out a kind of experiment that has been increasingly defining itself in clearer and clearer ways that are really just contingent and arbitrary, and really the result of whatever has happened, but not having much to do with the very possibilities of what freedom could mean. And what I mean is that as soon as a person achieves freedom, I think it's the most painful thing in the world. I think it's like the worst thing that ever happens to you, like when you get free. And what I mean is that the worst thing that happens to you can be the best thing that ever happens to you. Because freedom means not being given what has been taken from you. Because although I do reappropriate that, I think that's a mistake to begin with that thought. Freedom means affirming what we already are. And it means you have to choose. It means you have to confront the options that you have, and that you have to decide what is right for yourself. You have to decide what you're gonna do. You have to give yourself permission. But the reason that this is very painful is that no one can guide you. You have to live this out. So I go from Kant's conception of autonomy not into consumerist, reductive, liberal, superficial conceptions of freedom, but not only like the inspiring work of an anarcho-feminist, but also Friedrich Nietzsche. Because Nietzsche had a clear sense of the difficulty that freedom represents, the difficulty, the pain that freedom is, when it means that there's no prescriptions, like there's no banisters, as Hannah Arendt said. We have to think without banisters. And so that means that as soon as you are free, you have to ask yourself, like, who am I? Because as soon as you're free, you have to begin this process of self-examination in order to even discover what freedom is. So you're sort of like at the beginning of a really long, hard battle, and there's no other way around it. But this is the battle where, from Nietzsche's point of view, the very ontology, the ontology of your selfhood begins to expand through enduring life. That is not suffering in the way that other people do, and not giving into crying out when you encounter difficulty, because that difficulty is precisely what you're wanting to walk into. That difficulty is something you're wanting to be silent about, because you're enduring it. You're living through it. And that difficulty is the difficulty of autonomy. Autonomy is not sexy. It's not a beautiful thing. It's not poetry. That's why I go back to that. It's not philosophy and it's not poetry. It's something even more prior to that, you know? Because what I'm building upon is that, you know, the philosopher David Hume, the Scottish philosopher David Hume of the 18th century, had said that it's one thing to philosophize, but one must first be a human. You know, of course, he'd said one must first be a man, but I translate that as one must first be a human being. I mean, you can think all you want, but you have to begin with a human being, with being a human being. And that's something that very few people can really begin with, because it doesn't mean just yourself beginning with your fleshy, messy, complicated nature. It means like opening your eyes and beginning with the reality of where other people are at. Every one of them is in a different place, and you have to begin with that to build a relationship with them. And that's why, from an anarchist perspective, the possibility of society or even solidarity is very questionable. You know, I mean, even this affirmation of selfhood is questionable, because what I'm wanting to lead into is how it can relate to solidarity, how it can relate to a commitment to others, and how autonomy is not disassociated from other people, from living with other people. Again, that's a betrayal of autonomy, and it's those goddamn libertarians and others who in many ways just like stole from another tradition these ideas without really ever thinking about them as brains would think about them. Instead, they think about them as minds. And libertarians live in their heads without seeing that it's not just language and finances that make us always already a part of a society, but that there's an underlying embeddedness of which we are all participating. And it is crucial that we affirm individual freedom. You know, individual freedom is where the libertarians and the anarchists agree. But this ultimately has to do with the freedom of other people. And it's not merely that we're wanting to, like, through capitalist free markets, free other people in some strange, like, logic, like what they call, I can't think of it right now. It's the word that Lisa Simpson uses when she's talking to her father. I think she says that's specious reasoning. That's specious reasoning, libertarians. It's not that I'm not libertarian, because I'm American. So you can't be American without being a little libertarian. But I'm wanting to take back the idea that what we are wanting to cultivate is a relationship with others. But the reason that personal freedom is important is that what we're trying to do when we're trying to make sense of our freedom is we're wanting to become free of a reliance on others. It's not that we're advocating that stupid kind of personal self-reliance that means living on your own and then just being stupid about it. What it means is something that's more precious. What it means is beginning with a sense that one has to be aggressive. One has to take control of their life. And the only way that you can take control of your life is by not giving your mind away to being dependent on other people's ideas. You have to affirm your own ideas, and that's in many ways related to the difficulty of positive freedom, as I was describing earlier. The difficulty of deciding for yourself what freedom means and what freedom is. But in this sense, what autonomy and freedom begins to mean is that the reason that we are becoming free, the reason we become enlightened, the reason that we become self-governed, the reason that we learn to think on our own and have the courage to be self-willing, to test our ideas, to live through our ideas, is in many ways you're always already paying attention to the reality of other people. And if they're dependent, you're not wanting them to develop a codependency on you. That's crucial. You have to free yourself from people who are not free yet. That's one of the more bitter, difficult truths. You have to separate yourself from those who can't free themselves, because a big part of this autonomy demands that you go into yourself, and it could take 30 seconds, it could take 10 years, it could take lifetimes. It's why Buddhists believe in karma. But in order to be free, I think it's related to self-examination, and the unexamined life isn't worth living. I disagree with Plato, but I agree with that. And so what we're doing when we're self-examining is we're uncovering the falsehoods in ourselves. We're uncovering the buried superstitions and illusions that we live with, and we're in many ways we're destroying them. We're becoming ninjas in the life of the mind. You have to become dangerous towards yourself so that you are not smug about what you think, so that you are challenging what you think, so that you're engaging in this kind of self-examination that means taking a shovel archaeologically to your ideas that you just don't want to admit are your ideas, let alone challenge them. because that's a big part of what autonomy means, because there's no explanation of what it means. That's what's so difficult about this. I think that's why 99% of people like turn away from the explicit truths of life, and they end up buying into the implicit. And philosophy deals with the implicit, and so does poetry. But to begin with the explicit means to begin with this kind of direct attention to yourself that allows you ultimately to build a bridge with other people, because that's the very fruit of life. Like, the point of life is other people. Like, it's not that I'm not like a superficial child of the 90s, because I'm just as ridiculous as anyone. Like, and I grew up worshiping like Nike Air Jordans, and I believed in this stupid idea that through music and art I could have an effect on the world. You know, I bought into those ridiculous ideas that my emotions, that my subjective reality is really what matters. I mean, I can't believe it, but that's what I come out of. And it's through this kind of ruthless self-attention that in many ways, as much as I can, I've attempted to obliterate those. Now, why do I obliterate them? Well, on the one hand, it had meant in my life that I ended up buying into other ideas. You know, I replaced one idea with another, and that led me to exploring a whole plethora of different ideas, and I met all kinds of other people who have crazy ideas, and I explored them. But I think what I began to learn about 10 years ago is something that separates me as a thinking person, as a writer, and doing what I do. And it's that once we take apart our ideas, like once we realize how like stupid we really are, not that we're not beautiful and courageous and correct in many ways, we have to see that our whole cognitive structure is a house of cards. And in many ways, most people resist having it challenged, because once it falls apart, you fall apart. And that's what's so dangerous and deadly about drugs and alcohol, especially when you're young. If you take on those kind of experiences that drugs and alcohol can give you, you might never recover, because what you lack is the underlying discipline to do this, along with a way of remaking yourself through that deconstructive process. Because like, if you are a recovering drug addict and alcoholic, like, you're kind of in a really beautiful position, because you sort of took the evil stepchild devil baby with the bathwater, because sometimes the baby is a devil child, and the only way to take it is by taking the water. And what that means is that as a recovering person, you might actually have the courage that other people who don't even do drugs or alcohol don't have, because they're intoxicated with ideas, with fantasies, with all kinds of narratives and metaphysics and epistemologies and theories, whether conspiracy theories or critical theories, whether MAGA or Marxist, you know. But all of those are things that have to be deconstructed. It's not that there's not something going on within them that we're not always in many ways relating to. So we're not trying to be anti-intellectual or anything like that. But I think that what I mean to say that might separate me a little bit is that I believe in the perceptual. That is with a P, perceptual. And I think that what's going on in a lot of philosophy and dead poetry, the whole world of dead poetry, is that there's what another thinker has called a perceptual crisis. A perceptual crisis, you know, because we're so caught up in concepts, and that's what leads us to immediately wanting to replace our ideas that we find are illogical or superstitious. We replace them with other concepts. But what is that not? It's not, I'm not trying to be reductive or silly or pedantic. But when you open your eyes, like, what are you seeing? You know, as someone who lived in their head their most of their adult life, I didn't live in my head as a kid. I lived perceptually, and I think because I became a deeply conceptual person for a very long time, and I still am, I spend a lot of my days being conceptual, thinking through ideas. I also begin with the recognition that we have to begin with our reality. And our reality is something that we sense. It's not an idea. It's something that we have to pay attention to. And that reality demands daily attention, daily practice, because it's always changing. And so are we. And so we have to live in relationship to that change. And yet, what I also mean to suggest is something else. Once you've like Nietzsche once said, I am dynamite. I am dynamite. Like once you explode all your ideas, whether it's through like living a crazy lifestyle and just discovering that your ego was going to kill you, or you've had bad drug addictions that is in many ways a struggle with an ego, or you have lived a postmodern cynical lifestyle where you have no longer believed in anything because you can see through everything, or whether you're just a very rational, clear thinking person, which means that your life is very difficult because what you discover is the absurdity in almost everything. Like, what do you do once you're in that position? I'm asking a deeper question though, because what I'm asking about is the question of modernity. I'm not trying to be abstract again, but this is the question of modernity. This is the question of catastrophe. What is philosophy and poetry in relation to catastrophe? How is poetry and philosophy for 100 years, for 50 years, for 300 years lived in a disassociated way to the immediate catastrophe of our lives? It's not that other philosophers in different ways haven't been calling attention to this, but what would this mean on an immediate level to begin with the wreckage? You know? What does it mean to begin with the broken pieces of a life? Like after the Civil War, there were a lot of promises that were made, and they were never lived up to. It's not that we didn't struggle and strive and make great strides, but that these promises, which were never lived up to, are like schisms. They're like fractures within all of our stories and our narratives and all of our media that we're telling. And although a part of our beauty and our dignity as human beings is that we live coherent, unified lives, but underneath the surface are social, political, economic, philosophical, psychological schisms, fractures. Because what I mean to say is that there are questions that have never been answered, and they're not abstract because they're embedded in the living conditions of our life. And so to not be philosophical or poetic means to not turn away from this catastrophe. But it doesn't mean that it's bleak. It doesn't mean that when you go out, like where I live, if you go out to parts of the city, you could just see that there's something disconnected from that and what's going on when you go to the richer, more affluent ways. But it's not what you think. It's not what critical theorists are saying, and it's not what conspiracy theorists are saying. And it's not even what I'm saying. It's what you're saying. It's what you discover when you allow these conditions to begin speaking, but not in an intellectual way. Because it's not out there. It's inside of us. Because the reason that I'm wanting to speak about this is not that this insight isn't sort of the backbone of a lot of what I am, but I think there's an incredible opportunity for autonomy. And autonomy I've related to Nietzsche, right? But Nietzsche picked this up from Schiller. And Schiller is a thinker of the Romantic period who'd said something very interesting. He said that joy and pain are not separated. We like to think that they are, Schiller said, and Nietzsche built upon this. But in fact, the greatest joys and exhilaration of life are found precisely in the greatest difficulties and pain. He wasn't suggesting what the Marquis de Sade or others are saying, that we simply want to have painful lives, but that the very beautiful evanescence, the plenitude of life, its richness, like as a feeling, is also related to the difficulty of turning towards these difficulties. So autonomy and the beautiful life means taking the hard path. It means that you're not going to lie to yourself, and you're not going to take shortcuts, and you're not going to take a pill, and you're not going to turn away. You're not going to message somebody. You're going to decide on your own. And you're going to live through that decision. And you're not going to cry out. You're going to transform and transfigure that into something else. People do this all the time. We just don't see them. We are living embodiments of people who have made these decisions, who have turned upon this wreckage and turned it into something that, as Mariah Carey had said, you know, I'm going to do the best I can with what I got. And that's what the French call bricolage. You know, bricolage is what the bricoleur does. The bricoleur is one who can, as we say, work DIY. The bricoleur is one that can make something out of nothing. And that's what autonomy demands. And not only that, but we have to creatively author these decisions and give ourselves the fucking permission to make decisions. You know, authority is never rationalized. It's simply self-justifying. You can take authority. This is something at the heart of the anarchist tradition, except we can't associate it with all the cliches about what anarchists have done. What we're doing is teasing out an underlying set of techniques and tools that anarchists developed and that others have developed. That means we are not simply thinking critically, we're thinking creatively. Like, what is creative theory? You know, we know what critical theory is, but what about creative theory? Not only that, but what would that mean in relation to experimental living? You know, anarchists emphasize autonomous projects, experimental projects. And I think we have to grow comfortable with experiments. And experiments are what we live through. We're testing our ideas, testing our ideals. And each of us are testing these ideas and testing these ideals. And like I said, when we're developing this depth of ontology, crudely, superficially called independence, but I call autonomy, we're developing bridges with others. It's ridiculously understood as solidarity with leftists, but clearly that doesn't really work. And there are examples of solidarity that do work, but what has to be emphasized is the open-ended experimental nature of it all. And then again, I mean, our lives, like I work like other people do, that demands that you're giving in to a system of non-freedom. So it demands that one is sensitive to a life that means one is doing the best with what one's got. And I think I'm kind of conservative in certain respects. I don't know why I say that, but I'm kind of an extremist. And I'm not with other people. Like, I really truly love other people. And the only way that I can love is by giving them back to themselves and beginning with the singularity that they are and seeing each individual person as a world in themselves. But I don't have all the time in the world or all the energy in the world. So I have to like parse out, you know, my attention, you know. But I don't compartmentalize or balkanize, but I hold myself to a really high standard. And I think that's sort of how I freed myself from where I come from. You know, when I was 14 and 15 years old, I began discovering ideas of freedom that had to do with taking responsibility for your choices. And that gave me a stepping stone, because I was at a point when I was a teenager when I was told that I should be on medications, and I was almost put on medications. And I was at a point where I had certain predilections, you know, certain proclivities. And I could have ended up like in jail or like living a stupid lifestyle. But I think it's really arbitrary. I don't know, but I discovered this idea that is related to humanism, which is that you can affirm your freedom. I would later understand it to be existentialism. I discovered that when I was 16, 17. Existentialism as being this radical leap where one would decide for themselves what they thought And one would aspire to greatness. I mean, that's what I'm realizing. I had this idea that one could, on the one hand, understand life and therefore have control over life, and one didn't have to be pushed around or determined by life. That's what was born into me, was that I could affirm my own proactivity. I could be proactive, and I could affirm my own ability to not only understand life, but to control life. Because those things are related. Like, the degree to which we can have freedom is related to the degree to which we can't even understand our lives. Except that I developed an over-exaggerated idea of how much understanding and therefore how much control we could have. I live now a much more modest idea of what freedom is. But I wouldn't be who I was if I didn't have this overly exultant sense of what I could do. Like, I was inspired by Leonardo da Vinci and then Nietzsche, but also like Dennis Rodman and many others. And I failed. I fell on my face completely in life. But I wouldn't have discovered the incredible thing that I have had I not had this drive towards a conception of what I could do, of who I was. And as I discovered philosophy and discovered different conceptions, I deepened that sense of what freedom was. But I also developed a dialogue with all the difficulties of freedom, the questions of determinism. Like, I began not seeing myself as 100% free, but as wrestling with the historical question of contingency, the ethical questions of the other. And not only that, but I mean, if you look at Raskolnikov and Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, I read that when I was about 21, and I sort of sensed the limitations of my own radical conception of freedom, given that the character Raskolnikov is sort of a caricature of this Nietzschean type who misunderstands Nietzsche, as I actually did misunderstand him, and then lives out this farce. You know, you can end up in jail by overly believing in yourself. And in many ways, I'm lucky that I didn't end up in jail as a teenager, or that I didn't end up in many different ways. But you know, that was just the starting point. Like, I discovered the Renaissance when I was 16 and humanism. And then at 17, 18, I discovered Nietzsche, existentialism, postmodernity. But I was 23, I began discovering anarchy, which is a stupid word, but it locked in. I mean, I felt like I discovered the truth of the world. Like, I understand Gnosticism better now than I ever did. It's not that I was a Gnostic, but I had a taste for the Gnostic without realizing it. Because what I discovered in philosophy and even in Plato at 16 made me a kind of cultist, because I believed that I had a kind of superior upper hand on others. But when I became an anarchist, I had no separation of myself and others. I saw this as something that was like a gospel, as something that had to be said. And it's hilarious when I think back, because about 2009, I can distinctly remember telling people that by 2013, the world's going to be out of oil and civilization will begin collapsing, and we have to begin practicing a non-domesticated anarchist lifestyle if we're going to survive the collapse of civilization. And lo and behold, between the ages of like 23 and 27, I sort of like radicalized myself in a way that is similar to how other people in different parts of the world become radicalized. Like, if you know what I'm saying, you know what I'm saying. This is an important part of my own writerly life, is that for 10 years, that is when I was 32, I began pulling way back. You know, I was never the most active, politically minded person as an anarchist. I was always already like reading books and really interested in conversations. But between the ages of 23 and 32, I was always in the proximity of people who identified in very different ways as anarchists. They wouldn't use that word, but not only that, but they were more willing to push these ideas further into political action, into doing things. And I became involved in that. But in many ways, I was always in the backseat, like a writer is. It's not that I am a writer, but I've always thought like a writer, because since I was 23, I wanted to be a writer. But I mean, I haven't published anything, so I don't know why I say that. But I think that a part of the writer's identity is that you sort of want to have your cake and eat it too. And I was sort of blessed in that, in living the life that I did, I was able to observe things in myself that frankly scared the fucking shit out of myself. I scared the shit out of myself. Because I realized that I wasn't who I thought I was, and that I wasn't willing to live up to the radical ideas that I had. And I'm not trying to say too much, about what I did, but I will say that some people in this world are on a path, right? They change over time, and most people are not on a path, and they are who they are. They never change. They never have that conversation with themselves where they decide that there's a turning point in their life. I had those moments with myself where I decided that I had to pull back. I had to step back in order to think more clearly about what I was doing and what I was associated with. And not only that, but who I disagreed with. And for 10 years, part of my own pitch is that I dropped out of society, out of culture, in order to read and think, contemplate, to have a dialogue with myself and with others that I could about what I believed and what I thought. And not only that, but what others thought, what the other side is. As an anarchist, my nadir was the election of Donald Trump and Brexit and many other things that happened around that time. Because what I didn't like is the way the left, or the people that I was most connected to, reacted to Trump. It's not that I didn't agree with many of their disagreements with the MAGA crowd and the Trump crowd, but I think they lack self-awareness. I think they lack any sense of how ridiculous their positions are, how ludicrous their confusion for process is. Meaning that they confuse process for outcome. When you look at, and I'm trying to be careful not to name names, but when you see that what it ultimately is the same thing as what the right wing is doing, except that the right wing in many ways has the courage to simply assert itself. Not that they should assert themselves, because I certainly don't agree with them, but I certainly don't agree with those who in many ways want to speak in my name. And I think that that's a part of what autonomy is that no one can speak in your name. And a big part of the community, so-called community of the left, is that everyone is speaking in someone else's name. Whether you're a community activist or a labor activist, or whether you're speaking for particular genders or ethnic identities, you can only speak for yourself. And it's not that we're not speaking in dialogue where we have to always allow for so much, right? But what we're wanting to do is to affirm for ourselves what freedom is and what autonomy is. And I find that all of this falls apart when it comes to freedom, right? I've had 1,001 nights of conversations with the smartest, most courageous, most difficult people. And each day I wake up and once again, I face the conditions of my life. And the only way that I can be free is by affirming that life. And what I was beginning to say, I think the thing that I was getting into is that I'm trying to create a chronology for myself in terms of how I thought of freedom, right? Because once I got free of being associated with any identity or any kind of collective notion of autonomy. I had to get away from projecting it onto other people. That's the idea that I'm losing, that I'm trying to hold on to here, is that autonomy has to be self-determining. Because you can tell that I'm trying to create a separation between yourself and others. Autonomy means that you believe that you can make choices. It means that you believe that you can think clearly, that you can see what's in front of you, and that you have opportunities. And that by getting clear about those opportunities and about your reality, you can exercise a particular modicum of creativity. You can exercise the courage of acting, of choosing. And you can begin to even begin this, I hate to say it, but it's a kind of spiritual process of seeing yourself, not even as a self, as an idea, but as a thing, as a being, always already engaged in this experiment that can, if it wants to, take itself to be a victim. But autonomy has to resist that for yourself. And that's what I mean by being an extremist. Because I have no interest in political programs. Like, I have no interest in morality or ethics. I don't think autonomy has anything to do with that. It's not that it's amoral, but that it has to do with self-authoring, with self-authorship. And it's the hardest thing in the world to keep these worlds separated. Now, it's not that you have to, and it's not that you're not engaging in dialogue with others and learning from others, and like there's a moment where one can recommend things, one can suggest things, but it doesn't really apply if a person isn't beginning where they're at as an autonomous individual. And I'm kind of laughing to myself when I think about how often I've repeated that word, but I think it's because it's the only way to live. And I think that because it is correlated to a philosophical, poetic process, ultimately, inevitably, that it rewards itself. So autonomy is a reward in itself. It is not a means to an end. It's not a thing that is like a theory, because what it is the very source of being able to then think philosophically and poetically. And the more radically one lives a self-sufficient, independent life, and the more one grants the otherness of other people and then lives by building tenuous relationships with other autonomous people, the more one begins to see that it's no wonder that, like, we test our ideas with other people, because we're living with them. We're beings with other beings. And what I am intending to suggest is not an idea in itself even, but the kind of like splendor that comes with being clear about your own projects. Because autonomy goes back to positive freedom. We're all striving to create negative freedom for ourselves. We're all striving to create some space. You know, the most wonderful thing is leisure. And that's not something that is in the future, like in retirement. It's something that we have every day. So you'll see that every day you have opportunities to exercise your freedom, where you're not being beat down, where you're not being pushed around. And you can see that the terror that you might see, or the void that you might feel in facing that openness, when you have to decide what to do, right? Do I pick up my phone and look at videos, or do I read a book, or do I go hang out with friends? Like, this dizzying sense of having to make a choice is precisely what autonomy is, and it faces us each day. Autonomy is something that demands we actively make use of this time, and make use of the time as humans. Not that we're managing ourselves, not that we're creating goals, but we're doing something else. What we're doing is explaining to ourselves what our vision is. We're explaining to ourselves how all of the pieces tie together into a whole. We're deciding philosophically and poetically how all the wide various particularities of life come together. Whether it's a story that's like told in an afternoon, or it's a story that's lived. And hence the openness of it. There's no like set path, there's no set of principles in regards to what one should do with their time. In fact, what there is a radical plurality of options. And that's what I affirm in others, is the plurality. And it's astonishing how many different kinds of people there are out there. And so if we're going to affirm anything politically, it has to be this kind of plurality, which is perhaps the wrong word, because we're wanting to create a garden of people, you know, to create a garden of variety. Why wouldn't we want as many different kinds of people as possible? Like, that's something that I really delight in when I can, when I have time and energy, is just the sheer difference in people, given all the stories and backgrounds and like all the things that people talk about that they're interested in. And then there's all the things that they don't say. And it's not that there's not a unity behind it all. In fact, that unity is what allows us for a moment to see ourselves in them. That's what's so miraculous, is that we can see ourselves in other people. But this affirmation of plurality is dangerous, because it can also dilute and lead to mediocrity, because we're not attempting to simply suggest that everybody's on their own path, you know, and no one can say anything to anyone else, because that's precisely like not the case, right? It's precisely the case that we can measure ourselves against one another, and that in this plurality of gardens, there are types, there are people who are respectfully competing in dialogue, in creation. And it's in this spirited competition that autonomy like really does begin to thrive, you know. It's no wonder that this kind of ability to contain different kinds of autonomous people is the most combustible force out there. It's a force unlike any other, when you can bring people together whose different dynamics somehow synchronize and create, you know, another kind of force. And ironically, that's precisely the society we already have. You know, it's really wonderful and astonishing that everything holds together at all, that the whole world doesn't just fall apart, right? And there's that question of how much autonomy can one affirm, right, before it begins to bleed into something that is meaningless. Well, I think that's precisely what we see in mass consumerism, in the online world of social media and basically everything online, is this sort of like completely denuded, superficial sense of selfhood that has a mythology in itself. It has a kind of beauty in that pop music has a kind of beauty and a kind of resonance. But when you see how common it is, then you begin to wonder about what I'd suggested Schiller and Nietzsche had suggested, which is there a more pleasing kind of autonomy, right? Is there a more beautiful, a deeper feeling kind of autonomy possible than what we have in mass society? How can we deepen our own autonomy? How can we use it as something that becomes something beautiful, something wonderful? And that's where I think turning into these difficulties most matters, because for each person, these difficulties are just right in front of you. They're calling for you, and entering these difficulties and walking into these difficulties and this complexity without attempting to unify it, without attempting to explain it, without certainty, to enter it with eyes wide open and to see it as something that each one of us has to live through, has to make sense of, and has to live out. But in doing so, opens asunder poetry itself reborn. Poetry itself reborn from the mountains of life. Again, I'm speaking from the point of view of one that is speaking from the other side. And when we are operating with a sense of freedom that isn't merely linear, but is orthogonal, that is a kind of freedom that isn't merely thinking in one direction, but is in thinking in all directions, well, then you sort of begin to see what Henry David Thoreau had meant when he said that there are as many radii as can be drawn from a dot as there are possibilities. Something like that, that the radius in a circle is nearly infinite. So the ways to be radical are nearly infinite. And again, these ideas are elusive or perhaps uncomfortable to anyone who's already decided like what freedom means, what freedom is. And that's why we are separating their lives from our thoughts, from what we're doing. Because if people could exercise more freedom, they would. So a part of being free is seeing that truth, and then seeing that it has nothing to do with what you hold yourself to, and that you can see yourself as being completely free but not see others as free. Not that you look down on them or anything like that, but that you see them as determined. See yourself as free, but everyone else is determined. Because that will allow you not to understand them, but to see them. And not only that, but one should exercise autonomy oneself to the point where it's working against you, right? So where does grace come from? That's something that I haven't really discussed, but it's also like vital. Grace and autonomy are fundamental to life in a way that's almost pre-philosophical, pre-poetical. Because that grace is, it's so crucial for sanity and peace in life, except that it has nothing to do with religion or anything metaphysical. Grace means that one does as much as one can each day, but there's a point at which you can do no more, right? There's a point each day when you can no longer think and you have to stop. And there's a sense that it's not merely at the end of the day, but all throughout the day in all kinds of different activities, one cannot be thinking. One has to be living. And that is a kind of grace, you know, because it gives you the chance to just see everything as it is. And that's where I think life begins to explain itself, because that's what I was starting to discuss earlier about what one does after you've deconstructed all of your ideas and have analyzed all of your ideas and taken them apart. I think that life begins to explain itself, and freedom itself, as you practice freedom, not think it, but practice freedom as autonomy, it begins to make sense of itself. It begins to reveal itself, not as an idea, but as a beautiful thing that one lives through. These are my best thoughts on autonomy and freedom and what that means. And all of this is without considering the history of philosophy and the question of freedom and determinism. Those are questions for another day, because at the heart of corporealism, and corporealism is sort of my philosophy of being a body and being a brain, begins with precisely these kinds of considerations and ideas. And I tend to allow myself to lose myself from time to time in these recordings tonight, so that I can find my thoughts once again, so that I can recover my thought. Because I am so sickened by the number of overly schematic, reductive videos on YouTube, especially the AI ones, that what I'm trying to do here is to run the risk of making a fool of myself, which isn't a problem because I've been a fool my whole life. But I'm running the risk of making a fool of myself because I want to be a human philosopher. And that's precisely what's so lacking on YouTube or academia, is human philosophy, right? The messy, sweaty, I mean, look at me, the messy, sweaty, fleshy, carnal stuff of life. That's what I started this talk out about, was the stuff of life, you know? And that's what I am, the stuff of life. Like, I'm a human being. I'm a man first before I'm a philosopher, before I'm a poet. I am a human being, god damn it. So how about that? How do you like them apples, philosophers? Huh? How do you like that? Let's begin with life. Let's begin with ideas and terms that if you have to have them explained to you, like, you're not alive. I'm John Edward Willie, and this is Philosophy, Poetry, and Life.